Hello, hello. Back in the car. It's a nice, temperate April evening. Hopefully the weather maintains this calm but subtly optimistic and cheerful nature. We're not a fan of April snow, not too much rain, or freezing rain. To be discussed today, Jorge Luis Borges. Now, this is a tome. This is a huge book, a collection of his fiction writings. I figured it would not be appropriate to discuss all of his writings, so I'm going to hone in on two of his short stories. Originally, I thought to hone in on a volume. Now, this book is one of I'd say it's the most popular English print of Borges's writings, at least the most popular modern printings of his writings, collected fictions, or as he would call them, Ficciones. Now, it features. I'm not sure if it features all of his collected fiction works. I don't think it does. There are a few works I've read from Borges before I owned this book that are not in this book. At least maybe they had a different name and I couldn't find them, because the naming sometimes changes with some of his collected works. So I figured it would be an injustice to discuss all of his works, because Borges is, to me, a phenomenal writer. He's a writer that's quite important to me. I quite appreciate his writing, and I've held his writing for quite a long time. I've thought about it for quite a long time. I've marinated on it, and I have not read, I would say I haven't even read half of his short stories. Just because he's the type of writer I like to marinate on. I like to he's the type of writer who requires a few rereads, I believe, and it doesn't really change to me the enjoyment of his works, and that's the case for most writers. I think most writers rereading them, most writers that you enjoy, rereading them is another delight in itself. So this is a translation by Andrew Hurley, and it's the Penguin Classics Deluxe Edition. Now, I wanted to originally, after I realized that discussing all his writings would be an injustice, I wanted to originally discuss perhaps just a volume. But I figured even in that would not, that itself also wouldn't be enough for myself. So I've decided to discuss two of his short stories. Ficciones the Memorious. As it's referred to in this text, it's called Ficciones, his memory, I think, but most people know that short story as Ficciones the Memorious, as well as the short story Death and the Compass. Now, Ficciones the Memorious, I read that quite a while back, and I've reread it. I've read it at least twice. Death and the Compass I actually just read today, and I figured these two stories are from the same volume. I discussed them, and they're quite different themes, but they're themes that those short stories are quite different thematically, yet they incorporate certain themes and threads that prop up in much of Borges's writings. Now, who was Borges? Let's do the rundown of our Argentinian friend. He's right here. We see him right there looking all dapper. He's actually blind in this photo. He was blind for half of his life. He was born in 1899, I believe. He lived about 85 years or so. And for half of his life, he was blind. For the latter half of his life, he was blind. And he continued to write some of his greatest works. By the 50s, I think he was completely blind. He progressively grew more and more blind. So the two short stories that we're discussing today, his eyesight was already significantly ailing. Now, he's an Argentinian writer. He wrote originally in Spanish, and he's been emblematic in the South American as far as South American literature is concerned, but also as far as world literature is concerned. He predominantly wrote short stories. He also has a significant catalog of nonfiction work that is I haven't read any of it, but I would assume it's quite philosophical, but it also leans towards the creative nonfiction works that concern language and history. These are themes that are quite important to Borges. Some people pin him as he's as a bit of a sci-fi writer. He has a little bit of that kind of taste, that goût, but, and you can definitely see where that comes from. But compared to the science fiction that is published now, or even to his day, like H.G. Wells, he's quite different. He was, I think, quite familiar with H.G. Wells' work, and I think he quite enjoyed it. Now, while Borges was a writer, I think he foremost, and he would consider himself a writer, I think he foremost considered himself a reader. Reading was his most important activity, I think. I think if you took a gun to his head and you said you have to write or you have to read, he would choose reading any other day. He's very much a reader of a writer. And it's expressed in his books, in his short stories. His short stories often concern mazes, labyrinths, books themselves, themes of intertextuality, themes of how sort of literature influences the real world, and how literature sort of becomes manifested in the reality of real worlds become manifested through literature. Now, the two short stories that I'm discussing today don't really concern those themes of intertextuality as much, that theme. Instead, Funes the Memorious concerns memory, time, experience, and infinity for the most part. Infinity is also a consistent theme within Borges' works. The nature of time and distilling time into a small, sort of, but infinite experience. And that's very much what Funes the Memorious seems to be about. Now, Borges did say in the preface of the collection in which Funes the Memorious comes from, I believe that preface is also called, it's called Artifices. Artifices. In the preface, he said Funes the Memorious can be looked at as a metaphor for insomnia, which I can see after reading that, but I didn't think about that when I read it. Now, what does Funes the Memorious concern itself with? Funes the Memorious is a story in which there is a character. There's the narrator, who Borges presents himself as, which is a common way in which Borges writes his short stories. His short stories, by the way, are for the most part quite short. They rarely go past the 20-page mark. Some of them are even 1 page, which makes him quite a refreshing writer, because he kind of tries to distill it in a very precise way, his message. There isn't too much pomp. There isn't too much... he doesn't take too much time creating the setting, yet the settings also are quite... it's not that they're quite distinct in many ways, the settings in which he places his novels. But Funes the Memorious has the narrator, who we can, I guess, just assume is Borges, and he talks about, or a character, even though the story takes place years before Borges was born, it's written as if it is Borges, and he encounters this narrator encounters a boy who has a incredible knack for understanding time. He always knows exactly what time it is of day, exactly what time it is. He'll be like, "Yo, it's 3:33," without looking at a watch. He'll know what time it is. So this boy Ficciones has a mind that goes completely chronological, completely linear, but he completely understands to a T exactly what time it is. Now this character gets into an accident, a horseback accident. He falls off his horse and he becomes crippled, bedridden. However, he develops, after the accident, this uncanny ability to essentially have a spotless memory. He's able to recall absolutely every single thing about his experience. He's able to recall the smells, exactly how things looked like, exactly how things felt, exactly the nature of, whether it was rainy, sunny, exactly how things came into fruition. He's able to recall this absolutely perfectly. He even describes this character Funes. He describes being able to know every single grape that entered into a glass of wine. He was able to vividly recall that, but it's not even a case of recollection. It's a case of he is sort of haunted by this infinity, it seems, of his experience, this inability to forget. And Funes becomes bedridden, and he starts to read and consume books and knowledge, but after a while it just becomes too much for him. The stimulation is sort of overloading for him, and he's haunted by this inability to forget anything about his life. And I think it's anything about his life after the accident, I believe, if I remember correctly. And he ends up sort of, he cannot distinguish between, he cannot make generalizations, is a main point also to be made. So no one thing is like the other. In a sense, this is very similar to the idea of the after I recalled, I did a little bit of research. It's very familiar. It's familiar to the idea of the concept of nominalism and hecacity, in which no one thing in the world is alike another thing. Every single thing has its own unique name. Every single thing in the world. Hecacity, a concept, a Greek concept, but one that was expanded on by the Scottish philosopher Duns Scotus, and Borges definitely would have been familiar with that. Scotus is not mentioned, I don't think, in this short story. However, Locke is definitely mentioned as far as proposing this idea that no two things can have the same name. Locke then goes to say, or the narrator goes to declare that Locke rejected this. However, the main character, or the character in the novel, the eponymous character Funes, cannot seem to distinguish between he struggles to distinguish between two objects that are alike. So no two dogs, no two trees can be alike. To him, he wouldn't think of something as a pine tree. He would think of it as that tree over there with those branches like that, and blah, 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 blah. He could not make generalizations. And this haunts him, and it eventually leads to an early death and demise, which is crazy to think about it, because we would always like to think that having a great memory, having a flawless memory, would be something that we would want. This is something that we would want. But if you are not able to make generalizations or to abstract or to forget, that's a line in the books, you're not able to create, according to Borges, essentially creative thought. You're not able to sort of expand and differentiate, create a sense of difference. In order to think, you have to be able to forget. You have to be able to forget the past and sort of move on into a future of potential, a future of present. Now, Borges doesn't say it exactly like that, but I'm paraphrasing him. Perhaps I'm kind of adding my own shtick or my own interpretation of it. Funes eventually also ends up, in order to go through with this, because in order to create sort of ledger of all the things he remembers, he boils everything down to abstractions as far as numbers. And he starts to combine these numbers with letters to sort of recall and place things as they are. So an object would be a sort of a number and a letter, I believe, part of a sort of ledger that he would keep in his mind. And he, using this tally, he kind of keeps his mind occupied. He sort of boils everything down to the best abstraction for him, which are numbers. So Funes' memory of Funes the Memorious is one of Borges' most known short stories. I'd say he has so many short stories that are well known, though. And another one is Death and the Compass. Now, Death and the Compass is one that, while it does thematically deal with infinity, it's very much a sort of rewriting, a deconstruction in some ways of the mystery story. Now, Borges is not afraid of writing a type of mystery, his own version of like a mystery story. And that's what Death and the Compass is about. Now, it's almost an anti-mystery story, because after reading it today, I found it to be initially incredibly convoluted, and it was very complicated. And I think that's the whole kicker. That's the whole inversion about it. You feel like it's incredibly complicated, but then once the ending comes around, you realize that the mystery is pretty much solved after the first paragraph of the short story. And you kind of forget about that, which is the crazy trick that Borges does. So it follows the detective Lonrot, who has a grudge, at least someone has a grudge with this character Lonrot. And the story takes place in around the time I think Borges was living. Some of his stories take place during ancient times, medieval times. I'm not sure if any of his stories take place too far in the future, but this story is pretty contemporary for his time. It takes place around during when he was living. So the 20th century, maybe the 19th century. And I believe it takes place in Buenos Aires. But anyways, this detective Lonrot, who is he takes himself as very rational, a bit of a philosophical type, someone who kind of peeks between the firmament, between the curtains, and finds deeper meanings in things. But he's also a bit of a gambler. He's described as that. And he's a detective. And there is it's told in the first passage that there's a lot of characters that are that are introduced in the first passage, only for them to reappear there. But there's a character that holds a grudge with Lonrot. And the first passage also sort of exposes it's not exactly a linear story, in the sense that the ending is already expressed as to what is going to happen within the first passage. But there's a character, Sarlach, I believe is his name. Let's get to that part. Where is it? Nope, not. Is this the one? Where is it? Here. Boo. Don't mind this. Yes, so there's a character, Sacharlach, who has a grudge with Lonrot. Because Sacharlach, he's a sort of petty criminal, but his brother, I believe, or his relative, was confined and apprehended by Lonrot, and he swore vengeance against Lonrot. And it's told that Sacharlach swears vengeance against Lonrot in the first passage, but we kind of forget about it. We kind of forget about him as a character. And we go into what we think is the main story, which is that there's a murder that has happened, and Lonrot is ready to solve it. In fact, there's actually a series of murders that starts to happen. And the murders start to demonstrate a pattern. People are murdered the third of every month, starting, I believe, December, January, February. So there's a third of every month. And every murder sort of ties in clues that there's going to be another murder. But these murders actually turn out to be orchestrated by Sarlach in a way for him to sort of get the detective alone and in a place where he thinks he actually is going to find the fourth murder, which is going to be inevitably himself. So it's really a story about sort of perhaps these signs that we see, these mystical signs, they're not actually out there, but they are of our own making. And in a sense, we are trapped in our own webs of consciousness, but these webs of consciousness sort of can be appropriated by other people. Other people can tap into that in order to exploit us. And that's how I saw it. It's very much an inversion of a mystery story, and quite a fruitful read. Death and the Compass. So that's the discussion on Borges and his two short stories. Now, Death and the Compass, just to say, it feels incredibly convoluted at a time, and that's really very much the point of the story, is it starts to be really convoluted. You start to wonder what is happening in this mystery, and then you start to realize how simple this mystery actually is. But that's the discussion of these two Borges short stories. In the future, I hope to make a few other videos on Borges, because he's definitely a writer that I hold within myself. And he's the type of writer that I would even make perhaps videos about his same short stories. So, anyways, that's it. Take care.